The idea that the 2008 financial crisis began with reckless bankers, predatory mortgages, or greedy Wall Street traders is comforting because it makes the disaster feel modern, containable, born of a particular time and place. But the truth is far older and far more unsettling. The meltdown of 2008 was not an anomaly, but the latest repetition of a centuries-long pattern that began more than 400 years earlier, when Europe first experimented with the dark magic of credit creation, speculative frenzy, and the illusion that financial risk could be engineered out of existence. Because long before collateralized debt obligations and mortgage-backed securities, there were tulip bulbs in Amsterdam traded like exotic futures contracts, promissory notes in Paris stacked like mortgage bundles, and joint stock companies in London valued not by earnings, but by pure fantasy. And if you trace the genealogy of financial crises backward, peeling away derivatives and digital markets and high-frequency algorithms, you find that every modern collapse has an ancestor, that the bloodline of 2008 runs through the Dutch Republic of the 1600s, a small mercantile nation that accidentally built the first global financial system, complete with the earliest central bank, the first stock exchange, and the original financial engineering experiment where merchants discovered something intoxicating. That wealth could be created not by producing goods, but by rearranging paper claims to future value. And with that revelation, the world crossed a threshold it could never uncross, because speculation stopped being a side effect of trade and became the engine of it. And once people realized they could borrow against assets that didn't yet exist, or that existed only as collective belief, the seeds of every future crisis were planted, and the Dutch Golden Age became the cradle of leverage. As traders borrowed money to buy shares, used those shares as collateral to borrow more, and built pyramids of promise that looked solid until one gust of panic knocked everything down, a dynamic that would echo through history from the South Sea bubble to 1929 to 2008. And yet the Dutch mania was just the overture, because the real prototype of 2008 emerged in the early 18th century when a Scottish gambler turned economic visionary named John Law convinced the regent of France that he could rescue a bankrupt kingdom with a new invention called paper money, arguing that if the government could print banknotes backed not by gold but by confidence and land speculation, credit could expand infinitely, the economy would boom, and debt would magically vanish. And for a brief, intoxicating moment, he was right, as Paris became an inferno of speculation with the Mississippi Company's shares soaring 1,900% in a single year, drawing in nobles, peasants, merchants, and servants alike. Everyone convinced that wealth was now a technology that could be manufactured at will. But beneath the euphoria lay the same fatal flaw that destroyed Wall Street in 2008. The belief that risk had been conquered, that collapsing assets could be backstopped by clever financial architecture, that markets could be inflated forever if only enough people believed. And as in 2008, the collapse began quietly, with whispers that shares were overpriced, that the underlying assets, the supposed riches of the Louisiana Territory, were exaggerated, and when investors tried to cash out, they discovered Law's system was a hall of mirrors, that liquidity evaporated the moment confidence cracked, leading to a catastrophic run on the bank, hyperinflation, riots, and the implosion of the entire French financial system. An event so traumatic it poisoned France against modern finance for nearly a century and indirectly set the stage for the French Revolution. Yet, even that disaster was just one chapter in the prehistory of 2008, because a decade later Britain repeated the same experiment. With the South Sea bubble, creating a company with no real operations but selling shares on the promise of future glory while parliament members, generals, bishops, and ordinary citizens mortgaged their lives to buy in. And as the bubble expanded, it relied on the exact dynamic that fueled the 2000s housing market. Rising prices created the illusion of safety, which encouraged more borrowing, which pushed prices even higher, until the entire machine fed on momentum alone. And when reality caught up, fortunes evaporated overnight, investors were ruined, and Parliament launched desperate inquiries into corruption, shadow lending, and financial manipulation, blaming individuals for systemic failures, just as the U.S. Congress would do in 2009. And still the deeper lesson went unlearned, that every innovation in finance, no matter how brilliant, eventually becomes a weapon of self-destruction if it allows leverage to outpace the real economy. And what ties 1720 to 2008 is the same delusion. That risk can be separated, repackaged, and scattered so widely across the system that it disappears, because the Dutch used forward contracts, the French used share credit hybrids, the British used subscription schemes, and Wall Street used mortgage-backed securities. But the underlying principle never changed, which is why the story of 2008 really begins in London in the 1690s when England created the Bank of England and launched the first large-scale government bond market, teaching investors that government debt was safe, liquid, and endlessly expandable, a lesson that would culminate centuries later in the belief that U.S. housing prices could never fall, that AAA-rated securities were invincible, and that entire markets could be built on formulas claiming to predict risk with mathematical precision. But as soon as markets rely on that belief, they become fragile. Because safety breeds complacency, complacency breeds leverage, and leverage breeds catastrophe. And the mechanism is always the same. Assets rise, people borrow against them, lenders relax standards, borrowers take on more risk, intermediaries package the debt into increasingly complex instruments. Everyone convinces themselves that the boom is permanent, and then, triggered by some small catalyst, a missed payment, a rumor, a shift in sentiment, the entire edifice starts to crumble. And once the first crack appears, panic spreads faster than any central bank or government can contain, because credit systems are not physical machines, but psychological ecosystems that collapse the moment faith evaporates, which is why every great financial crisis in history, including 2008, ultimately becomes a crisis of belief. And the reason 2008 felt so apocalyptic is because it wasn't just a housing bubble popping, but the culmination of 4 centuries of accumulated innovations, mistakes, and illusions converging at once. The endgame of a system built on the belief that risk could be tamed by mathematics, that markets could self-regulate, that home prices could only rise, and that the world had evolved past the primitive booms and busts of earlier eras, when in fact we were reenacting them in high definition with digital speed. Because the same emotional currents that drove Dutch tulip traders to bid bulbs higher than houses, the same greed that drove French nobles to sell everything they owned to buy Mississippi Company shares, the same manic optimism that convinced Londoners that the South Sea Company would dominate global trade, were present in the 2000s real estate market, where families, investors, banks, and hedge funds all believed they were participating in a new kind of prosperity immune to the old cycles, only to learn that human nature had not changed at all. And as mortgage defaults began to rise in 2006, the financial system, like the Mississippi Bank, in 1720, discovered that the liquidity it relied on was an illusion, because the moment people tried to sell, there were no buyers. The moment firms needed cash, lending froze, and the moment losses appeared, institutions that were supposedly diversified and hedged turned out to be dangerously interconnected, their fates tied together by complex derivatives they barely understood, creating a chain reaction that echoed the bank runs of 18th-century Paris and the parliamentary panic of 1720. London, as one institution's collapse triggered another's, until the world realized that the global financial system had become a single, tightly wound organism capable of dying all at once. And when Lehman Brothers fell, it was like the bursting of the South Sea bubble or the collapse of John Law's bank, only magnified 1,000 times by globalization, sending shockwaves through Asia, Europe, and the Americas, freezing credit, destroying millions of jobs, wiping out pensions, destabilizing governments, and revealing that the same leverage-driven fragility that infected early modern finance still defined the 21st century, because we never fixed the underlying flaw, the tendency to build economic structures on layers of borrowed money, abstract promises, and optimistic assumptions that work only as long as no one questions them. Which is why the true origin of 2008 lies not in Wall Street boardrooms or American suburbia, but in the birth of finance itself, in the first moment. Humanity realized it could trade the future for the present, turning time into collateral and risk into a commodity, and ever since that moment, every society that embraced financial innovation has eventually pushed it too far, believing that this time the old rules don't apply, that this time we've learned from the past, that this time the system is safe. until it's not. And that is why understanding 2008 requires understanding the centuries of crises that preceded it, because the meltdown was not a modern glitch, but a historical inevitability. The latest chapter in a story that began with tulips, swelled with empires, detonated in the Enlightenment, echoed through the Industrial Age, and finally erupted in the digital era. And unless we recognize that our financial system is built on the same human impulses, fear, greed, optimism, denial, that shaped every collapse before it, we will repeat the cycle again. Because history does not recycle events, it recycles behaviors, and the 2008 crisis was simply the moment the past caught up with us, reminding the world that credit is not wealth, confidence is not stability, and that no matter how sophisticated our tools become, we are still living in the same fragile architecture first assembled 4 centuries ago, an architecture destined to shake, crack, and collapse as soon as we forget where it came from and why it keeps falling, leaving us to ask the same question generations before us asked in the ashes of their own crises. If this is the lesson history keeps teaching, why do we keep refusing to learn it?